Hello, folks. Welcome back to WW2 TV and the last show of this week. And just to let you know, there are two shows with a Philippines theme next week as well. Jonathan Horn and Peter Mansour are on talking at various points about MacArthur and the campaigns of Philippines. But right now, it's still War Crimes Week, and we are looking at the trials today in the Philippines. And Dr. Ricardo Jose returns to the channel to talk about his countrymen's involvement in both local trials and a little bit on those in Tokyo, but mostly in the Philippines. His previous appearances are in the description below. And as you know, who've watched him before, you're always in from a masterclass with Rico. So I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
Good afternoon. In this case, it's good evening to those in the Philippines. I'm doing well. I'm fine. Hope you're all well. And everyone
we were
else.
just chatting before War Crimes there, and obviously, you've talked about the Filipino experience broadly in history. You've talked about, the American liberation, and we've touched on the years that followed and independence and a new future. The War Crimes trials over there, before we get into a presentation, is it something people talk about, or is it kind of left in the past?
It's something that very few people know about. Of course, they know about the Yamashita trial. Everyone's looking for Yamashita's gold, but that's about it. Even the other trials by the U.S. Army, hardly anyone knows anything about them. The Tokyo trials, I guess people know about it in passing, but hardly anything. And the Philippine trials, virtually nothing is known.
I think what we've been discussing about with some of and we will continue to discuss, is that all of these trials, they cause the people of the country to examine their own roles. That turned up particularly in the trial about Klaus Barbie, where in France, where the defense counsel was saying, yeah, but if he's guilty, all of us are guilty. We all turned a blind eye to things. We all did, and the Philippines had its fair share of complications. People anti-occupation, people kind of pro-occupation, dealing with how you just go on with your daily life during the occupation. But there are, of course, within that some actual crimes. So we're going to bring up your slides now. And folks, fire away with specific questions you have about any of the details, but any broad questions about how the trials are remembered, we'll do those at the end. But I'm going to hand over to Ricardo now to take us through this. So over to you, sir.
Yeah, okay. So good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. So I'll be talking about especially Philippine participation in the Japanese war crimes trials. I'll be focusing on the trials in the Philippines, but unknown to many people was that we were also involved in the Tokyo War trials. So I will quickly look into first what was going on, why the war crimes trials had to be held. There were atrocities in the Philippines, of course, during World War II. As soon as the war started, there were already the conventions, the agreements made before the war had already been broken. Surprise attacks before the declaration of war. Manila was declared an open city in December 1941 to save it from bombing, and yet it was bombed even with the public declaration of it was a no fighting zone, and the military forces left Manila. So some of our landmarks were destroyed in that first month, and this was flagrant violation of the laws of war. And then after Bataan surrendered, there was the Bataan Death March, which some of you are probably familiar with, and the maltreatment of prisoners of war. Whether they were American or Filipino, that didn't matter. They were all treated very harshly. And then there was, continuing on throughout the occupation, was the torture and killings of civilians suspected to be linked to the guerrilla resistance movement. Whether or not they were, many of them were tortured, a number of them were executed, many without any summary trial whatsoever. So this is a photograph of Santo Domingo Church, which was destroyed by Japanese bombs just before the year 1941 ended. The church was totally non-military. It was an icon in Manila. It was a symbol of faith. It was one of the most beautiful churches in Manila and was destroyed in the first month of war. It was never rebuilt. So it was one of our losses at the beginning of the war. This is a picture showing the beginning of the Bataan Death March. We don't know how many of these men, most of them here are Filipinos, would actually survive the march or the prison camp experience afterwards. The commanding general of the Japanese forces at that time was Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa, who was commanding the 14th Army at that time. He was the highest army commander in the Philippines at that time. And so obviously when the war ended, these early crimes would be subject would be placed on his lap, that he would be held responsible for all of these. And by the time Homa would be tried, the precedent had already been set, both in the Philippines and elsewhere, the idea of command responsibility. And so, since Homa was on the top at this time, all the trials, all the cases that happened under him, he was responsible ultimately. And uh, Homa was succeeded by another Lieutenant General, General Tanaka, who did not survive the war. He was here for a few months. He was ambushed by guerrillas in the south, succumbed to some disease in the south, and was sent back to Japan to recuperate. When the war ended, the second commander in the Philippines was in command of the Tokyo regional area. And when the surrender of Japan came, he committed suicide. So that's number two. He could not be tried anymore because he committed suicide. So the third commanding general in the Philippines, or the Japanese army in the Philippines, was Lieutenant General Shigenori Kuroda. This picture was taken in 1943 when he was looking at a campaign against to wipe out the guerrillas in part of Luzon. We'll see later on that he would be one of those particularly focused on by these war crimes trials. Of course, Homa, we mentioned, would be tried and eventually executed. But Kuroda, how many of us know who this guy is? It was under Kuroda's term as commanding general that incidents such as this, torture, this was widespread. Fort Santiago is a place in Manila. It was an old Spanish dungeon, and this was one of the basic tortures that anyone suspected of being anti-Japanese was subjected to: beating with a 2x2 piece of wood. And there are many other stories about what happened there, but that happened during General Kuroda's term. And directly below Kuroda was the chief of the military police, the Japanese military police, Colonel Akira Nagahama. All these tortures, all these summary executions of suspected guerrillas took place under the watch of Colonel Nagahama. So after Homa, after Kuroda, you would have people like Nagahama who would be held responsible for all of these very painful tortures and crimes and executions that took place. He survived the war, and as we will see later on, was tried and eventually executed for his crimes. Uh, Late in the war, there were atrocities, of course, in the Battle of Manila. I think this has been discussed at one of the programs we had before. In February 1945, the most atrocious killings, massacres took place in Manila, very well documented, photographed, and very well, everything was really laid out in detail. And aside from what happened in the Battle of Manila, there were also many local massacres that took place, not just in Manila, but outside Manila. From the extreme north of the Philippines, in the Batanes Islands, for example, all the way to the extreme south of the Philippines in Mindanao and Sulu. So there were various local massacres that took place. So the whole Philippines actually felt these massacres. So when the war ended, there was this quest for accountability and justice. Someone has to be responsible for all of this, and someone has to pay. And as it was in Europe, the sentiment was very strong that these people who were responsible for these crimes have to be subjected to justice, and they have to be, as much as possible, punished for what they had done. So the last of the commanding generals in the Philippines was General Yamashita, who arrived here in October 1944. But again, the atrocities at the end of the war, the Battle for Manila atrocities, the local massacres that took place in late 44 and early 45, these were all laid at his doorstep because he was the guy on top. It was he who was in charge of the army at this time. The Navy was also there, and that's another problem, but we can discuss that later on. So directly under Yamashita, General Yamashita, was Lieutenant General Shizuo Yokoyama, who was commanding a group, the Shimbu group, that was east of Manila. His jurisdiction included Manila. So aside from Yamashita, Yokoyama, being junior to Yamashita and more directly involved in the Battle of Manila atrocities, would also be held accountable for what happened in Manila and the surrounding areas. This is, of course, one of the many pictures taken of the massacres that took place in Manila. But there were also, as mentioned, massacres that took place in various places in the Philippines. This is one victim of a rather unknown massacre that occurred in the east side of Luzon, outside a small town called Infanta. This was extremely bloody. The town was almost wiped out. And the commander of the unit that was here was a Japanese Navy Rear Admiral Furuse. He survived the war and also would be held responsible for what happened there. Furuse would have been in Manila actually during the Battle of Manila, but he was managed to get out and made his way to the eastern side of Luzon. But this is where this massacre took place. So the Philippines now seeks uh, justice in different forms of different types of war crimes trials. Perhaps the most famous international one, the biggest level, was the International Military Tribunal in the Far East, or the IMTFE, also known shortly as the Tokyo Trials. Now, this was supposed to try the highest level of Japanese officials, military, navy, and state officials who were seen as being responsible for bringing Japan to war. Now, the Philippines would participate in this, as I will discuss in a little while. More directly related to what happened in the Philippines would be first the US military tribunals in Manila, which actually were not entirely US military tribunals because Filipinos participated in them, not only as witnesses or as survivors, but also lawyers participating in the prosecution, and in a few cases, even serving as commission members themselves. Then the last and most detailed description I will go into would be the Manila War Crimes trials that were held by the Republic of the Philippines, 1947 to 1949. By this time, the Philippines had become independent and it inherited the task of seeking justice for these Japanese war criminals. So, if we start with the first level, the highest level, the international level, the International Military Tribunal in the Far East, which lasted from 1946 to 1948. The Japanese officials who were tried here were what were called the Class A war criminal suspects, who were charged with crimes against peace. I think in Nuremberg, even this was not that well developed yet. So this included things like planning for war, preparing for war, initiating the war, and waging the war of aggression. In the case of Japan, this meant not just 1941, but this went all the way back to 1931 when the Japanese army invaded Manchuria. So it would actually cover a 15-year period. So that was what the Tokyo trial was supposed to look at. The top levels of the Japanese government, the army and navy, and seek justice for them. A number of those who were charged in these Tokyo trials actually had direct links to the Philippines. General Hideki Tojo, who was prime minister at the start of the war, was responsible for the decision to invade the Philippines. He visited the Philippines twice in 1943. One of those also tried on the highest level was General Akira Muto, who was General Yamashita's chief of staff. Muto was actually involved in the rape of Nanjing, and so he was involved very heavily in what happened in the China incident, or the Chinese-Japanese war before war actually broke out. And then you would have Admiral Toyoda, who was commander of the combined fleet of the Japanese Navy. It was he that Filipino prosecutors looked at for ultimately ordering the rape of Manila in 1945. So, what was the Filipino participation in this trial? Well, we had one justice, Justice Delfin Haranilla, who represented the Philippines. He did not start the trial on time because the trial started before the Philippines was technically independent. So an election had to be held, and with the new president coming in, the choice of Haranilla was a little delayed. But he did come to Japan, to Tokyo, and attended easily 80 to 90% of the hearings there. There was a lawyer from the Philippines who carried the Philippine face, the massacres in Manila, the death march, and so forth. This was a practicing attorney by the name of Pedro Lopez, who is largely forgotten in most of the Philippines, but he has a street named after him in his hometown. What is interesting here is that Justice Haranilla, being part of the international body of commissioners, would actually issue a separate concurring opinion. None of the other justices issued that. His was quite defensive. He was defending the legality of the Tokyo trials. He even defended the dropping of the atomic bomb, incidentally. But the one interesting thing about his concurring opinion was he felt that the majority decision was too lenient on the Japanese,
Mm.
that he felt that they had to be punished even more. He did not name specific names, but he felt a stronger punishment was something that was lacking.
Just a quick question for you.
Yes,
This Filipino involvement in these early Tokyo trials, was it
yes.
something the US sort of
Mhm.
invited the Filipinos to join, or was it something your countrymen had to kind of fight to be part of? Because by 45, the US
Mhm.
military and is massive. You know, it would have been very easy for them to just kind of roller coaster over everything because they're
Right.
dealing with war crimes across. I mean, I wouldn't even want to list the number of islands and provinces and countries they're dealing with crimes in. So, did they say, look, we need your positive participation, or did your countrymen have to kind of fight for it?
I think both. Both of those are true. The Americans did want a representative from the Philippines, and the
Right.
Philippine government itself wanted very much to have a representative there. In fact, this comes very closely also after Britain had recommended a representative from India. So when the Indians nominated a justice to serve on the bench, then, well, if India was to have a representative, then the Philippines very well deserved to have a
Mm.
representative on the bench too. So
It's
there
like
was,
that. It's like, sorry to interrupt. It's like that sort of Potsdam period when countries that are smaller are making sure that they have got a say in the way the world is going to go on, because the big powers are coming out of the war even bigger than they were going into it, the USSR, the USA, and
right,
arguably even China. So
right,
if you're Lithuania or you're the Philippines, you know, even though you're looking for, perhaps for your own destiny, we've talked about this before, the desire for independence, you don't want to be left behind out of
yeah,
the international goings on because you're thinking about your own country's destiny. So
yes,
there's a lot going on for the Philippines now, both in the past and the future.
yes, that's true. But I think the Filipinos felt that we had the right to sit, we had the
Yeah.
right side, and so I think the mood in the Philippines was, yes, we have to have someone there. And Haranilla was before the war he was Judge Advocate General of the Philippine Army, so he had enough legal training in the military, and he did try to learn as much as he could about international law when he was in
Okay.
Tokyo.
Thank you.
So
Back to you.
yeah, so this is a photograph of the bench, and you'll notice the Philippine flag on the right side, and Haranilla is seated at the extreme right of this photograph. So he's already listening to the prosecution and the defense and so forth. This is what he looked like in his chambers during a recess in the Tokyo trials. And this was lawyer Pedro Lopez with the Philippine prosecution team who would argue for justice in what happened in the Philippines. The Philippine side would actually bring in witnesses to testify in the Tokyo trials. So that cost a lot of money. Not everybody could be brought to Tokyo to testify. Others had to give sworn statements, but as many as possible were brought to Japan to testify on site. So that's it. The Philippines did play a role, but of course there was a bigger picture there, and the Philippines was just trying to be part of that. On the more practical side of things, the US military had established tribunals in Manila as early as 1945. In fact, before the war ended, the US military already had a war crimes division which was investigating and researching war crimes in the Philippines, the massacres, the killings, the arson, all of these crimes against international agreements. So the U.S. War Crimes Branch in Manila did a lot of research, interviewed, took testimonies from eyewitnesses, and so forth. Now, the main difference between the U.S. military tribunals in Manila and the Tokyo trials was that they would try only Class B and Class C war crimes. The Class B war crimes were considered conventional war crimes. Those that were against the Geneva Convention, for example, regarding treatment of prisoners of war, that the prisoners of war had to be given adequate food and medical services, that they could not be worked to death and so forth, that they had to be treated fairly. That was the main aspect of the Class B war crimes that were tackled in Manila. The Class C crimes were crimes against humanity. These were essentially massacres of civilians, executions of innocent civilians without any trials, without any sense of justice, and all of this. The data had been compiled even as the war was going on. Photographs were being taken, testimony was being taken down, and so forth. And the top Japanese commanders in the Philippines would obviously be targets of the military tribunals first. The first one, in fact, was General Yamashita, who we'd seen earlier. Yamashita surrendered to the Allied powers on September 3, 1945, and immediately after the surrender was whisked to the New Bilibid prisons to the south of Manila and was already considered a suspect. The trials would start in October. Very quick trials. By December, the trials were over. Significantly, the decision for General Yamashita was laid down on December 7, 1945, the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. So MacArthur wanted these trials to be very quick, no questions about them, no legalities, finish them as soon as possible. And after the decision is made, there was an appeals process, and it could go up to the Supreme Commander of the Allied powers in Tokyo, or would go even higher than that. So for the top Japanese commanders in the Philippines, that is Generals Yamashita and General Homa, they would of course be tried. But we would also see quite a number of military police or Kempeitai commanders. We remember the picture of Colonel Nagahama that we showed earlier. He was one of those who was tried because he was extremely brutal to not just Filipinos suspects, but also Americans as well. And there were many local commanders and individuals who also figured in war crimes. Again, the B and the C war crimes. They did not necessarily include Americans. Some of them were involved in massive Filipino massacres, south of Manila, for example. They were tried by these American military tribunals. Perhaps the most famous of these tribunals is the Yamashita trial. This is a picture taken during the one phase of the trial. It was held in what is now the U.S. Embassy, the ballroom, and it still looks like this even today. So if one is lucky enough to visit the U.S. Embassy, you will see that this has not changed very much, except for the desks being missing, but it's basically the same. Now we have the other commanding generals, General Homa and General Kuroda, who I mentioned earlier. Here they are in Japan, being arrested prior to being sent to the Philippines. Now, both of them, Homa and Kuroda, are in civilian clothes. Yamashita, during his trial, was in military uniform all throughout. Homa, because once Homa returned to Japan in 1942, he was in disgrace and he was never given a military command again. He was placed on the inactive status and so therefore was a civilian for the rest of the war. General Kuroda was not looked upon favorably by the Japanese military after his stint in the Philippines. So he was not given a high command also and eventually became a civilian. So both of these, who would be accused in subsequent war crimes, were in civilian clothes at this time. This is Colonel Nagahama. We saw an earlier picture of him. Here he is looking over his former domain of Fort Santiago, and the court actually visited it to see where all the atrocities took place. So all of them, Yamashita, Homa, and Nagahama, will be tried and convicted and found guilty. All of them will be executed. Filipino participation in these trials were not just as witnesses, but also as prosecutors. And in the Yamashita trial, you had an assistant prosecutor, a Philippine Army lawyer, who actually figured very prominently in trying to get the court to decide that Yamashita was guilty. The Homa trials also had a prominent Filipino lawyer who was arguing for the prosecution. In the case of the Homa trial, you had a Filipino officer, the top-ranking military officer, General Valdez, was Chief of Staff of the Philippine Army, sitting in as a member of the commission. He did not experience the death march or any of that, so he was the highest-ranking officer to serve from the Philippines in the commission. So they did serve as both commission members and prosecution lawyers. This is the main Filipino legal officer, and it's interesting to see that his family name is Opinion. So one could wonder if one was an outsider, would this have been a proper lawyer with a name of that sort? But anyway, he did distinguish himself. And after the trials, he would even continue on with a distinguished career in the legal service of the Philippines. Now, let's move into the Philippine war crimes trials themselves. This is what is probably least known of all of these trials. A book came out fairly recently discussing these trials. It is available now. It was her PhD dissertation, but it did not bring out too much the Philippine perspective that well. There is another book that is a very good book on the Philippine trials. It was written by a Japanese, and it is available only in Japanese, but it's the most thoroughly researched work on the Philippine war crimes trials. So I'm trying to get the author to try to translate it at some point and have it available to non-Japanese readers. So the legal basis for the Philippine war crimes trials was established even before the war, or just about when the war ended, the day after the war ended, August 16, 1945. The National War Crimes Office was established by executive order under the Philippine Army Judge Advocate General. This was created by the President of the Philippines at that time, President Sergio Osmeña. It did not have any specific courts yet, although it was tasked with ensuring that justice was meted out to the Japanese suspects. So there was no time for this particular National War Crimes Office to actually hear any Japanese trials, but they had no courts, but they assisted the U.S. Army military tribunals nonetheless. Now, once the Philippines became independent in July 1946, the president of the Philippines at that time, President Manuel Rojas, would issue a new law, executive order, creating or revising the National War Crimes Office. And that would be one that could now hear cases, that would actually decide on these cases. And within the Philippine Army, a War Crimes Division would be created as well. So the legal process was established very clearly. There were executive orders. The legal process was laid out as well as it could. And the Republic of the Philippines took over the cases not completed by the American tribunals. The American tribunals lasted for about 2 years, on to early 1947. But by the middle of 1947, the Philippine government was now ready to take up the cases that had not been finished and add more to them. So the more specific focus for the Philippine cases were the atrocities against Filipinos. The American military tribunals focused largely on American prisoners of war, the execution of flyers who were captured by the Americans, and so forth. This time, the Philippines would focus on the crimes committed on Filipinos.
And
So
just a
this
quick
is,
question: as they're moving forward, I'm assuming
yes.
because the Philippines is in its infancy as an independent nation, they're
Yeah.
using the US
Mhm.
systems and protocols legally to then build on to create their own versions. Because you're not going to start writing an entire
Mhm.
new legal manifest. Yeah, so
Yeah.
basically US protocols.
Yes. Basically, the trial procedure, the process, everything was based on the American system. However, in 1938, the Philippine Army, and through it, the Philippine government, issued a manual called the Rules of Warfare. And so we also had our own set of rules. The Americans, the US had what they called the Rules of Land Warfare, which was used
Yeah.
extensively in the American phase of the trials. But in the Philippine phase of the trials, both the American manual, the Rules of Land Warfare, and the Philippine manual would be interchangeably used.
Okay, thank you.
So yes, but again, the whole process was something new to Filipinos, particularly the commission members and the lawyers who would handle the case. So they had to take virtual crash courses with
Mm.
the American legal officers still in town. But anyway, this is President Osmeña. It was he who created the first National War Crimes Office in 1945. He would be succeeded by President Manuel Rojas, who created a stronger National War Crimes Office, which now could establish its own commissions, its own tribunals, and hear cases and decide on them. So this was the staff of the National War Crimes Office. They were all basically Philippine Army officers. What's interesting here is that we don't have any Americans here. We have no foreigners. This is an entirely Philippine staff. They were all lawyers. They were all in the Philippine Army. Some of them were regular officers in the Philippine Army. Many of them were reserve officers who had been extended after the war. So let's go into the military justice judges. Who were the Filipinos who sat on these commissions? They were basically regular Philippine Army officers. And as much as possible, the ranks of the Philippine side corresponded with the ranks of the Japanese being tried. So if you have a Japanese colonel being tried, the Philippine side would have to have colonels in the commission. If you have generals, then you would also have to have Philippine generals trying. If you had lieutenants or privates, then you could have majors or you could have lieutenant colonels and so forth. But this was followed very strictly, that there had to be some kind of equivalent between between the Filipino Commission and the Japanese being tried. Now, since almost all the Philippine Army officers in the Commission or in the National War Crimes Office, they all had some World War II experience. Either they were in Bataan or they were with the guerrillas or whatever. So some members inhibited themselves if they felt that the cases involved would be tainted by their own experience. I knew one person who really, he was there in Bataan, and when they were talking about the death march, he voluntarily inhibited himself because he said, I cannot be part of this because I experienced the whole thing myself.
Wow.
So there was this kind of responsibility. You know, we are answering not just to the Philippines, we're not just answering to the call of justice, but we're also answering to history because
Yeah.
history will judge us in the end. So we cannot make a mistake. The Philippines was a very young nation at this time, and we had to show the world that we were capable of international level
Mm.
matters. So this was General Basilio Valdez, Philippine Army Chief of Staff. It was he who sat in the Yamashita trial and the Homa trial, representing the Philippine government. And in the cases of the Japanese generals tried by the Philippine government, it was he who sat in as the senior member of the Philippine Commission. For the Navy, we had a very fledgling Navy. This is a pre-war photograph of, he was then Major, Lieutenant Colonel Jose Andrada, but by 1947-48, he had risen to flag rank. And it was he who would be tapped because he was the senior Filipino naval officer. It was he who was tapped to try the most senior Japanese naval officer who was also subject to trial, Admiral Furuse. So there would be a very important briefings for the prosecution. The chief prosecutor was a very experienced lawyer, Captain Nicolas Maronilla Seva, who had been a lawyer before the war. He was now in the Philippine Army. And Philippine Army lawyer officers, both regular and reserve, served as prosecutors. And they did study up on their law very well. A Filipino officer, Captain Pedro Serran, headed the defense team. Now, it's rather interesting to note that there would be defense teams by Filipinos because considering the fact that the atrocities were on Filipinos and virtually everybody was angry at the Japanese, that you would have Filipinos defending the Japanese. And initially, the government decided, all right, to be fair, we will grant the Japanese accused with 2 defense lawyers per defendant. So this was a way to show that we are equal. We have no, we're not grinding any access. We will
Yeah.
give every single Japanese defendant two lawyers of their choice from Japan. But the problem was halfway as the trials were being conducted, the Japanese defense lawyers tried to stall, and to delay everything. They began by trying to delay, questioning the legality of the process, questioning the coverage of the crimes and all of this. And finally, you have Captain Maronilla Seva going to the Japanese defense lawyers' quarters one day and to ask them, why are you delaying? Let us push forward these cases because they'll drag on forever. And when he was there, he was blocked by one of the defense lawyers. And then another Japanese defense lawyer pounced on him in the back, and the group of Japanese lawyers began pounding him and beating him up. They had to call for outside help to break up the fight. And that resulted in all of these Japanese lawyers being sent back home. And
Mm.
so, to replace the Japanese lawyers, Filipino lawyers were named in their place. And I got to know one or two of these defense lawyers, and I said, what did it feel like to defend the Japanese? This was a very unpopular thing to do. The person I knew quite well who was in the defense, one of the Japanese, even was a Bataan veteran. He had marched the death march. He saw what the Japanese had done, really the worst part of what the Japanese had done. And he told me that, well, my loyalty was not to myself. My loyalty was to the legal profession. I saw
Mm.
that I am loyal to a higher ideal. When I took the oath of being a lawyer, I didn't choose personal sides. This was something beyond my personal whims. And so it seems like almost all those Filipinos who were assigned as defense lawyers felt the same way. And the Japanese did recognize that. Many of them did send letters of appreciation after the trials were over. So even Filipinos were criticizing these defense lawyers because they said, are you traitors? What are you doing? But they took it in stride, and at least the ones I met were very proud of the fact that they did not bend their legal profession or their legal ideas to the tune of the times. There were also Filipino and Japanese descendant interpreters because you did have to translate everything. The
Mm.
procedures had to be interpreted. The documents had to be translated from English or whatever language they were in into Japanese. Again, to be fair. So this was a great deal of effort to try to translate everything so the Japanese would be able to read it, or they would be able to follow the process. There was one item I did not mention here that all the courts, all the commissions had a legal officer. They had a law officer, and he was the one to decide whether, let's say, the prosecution's line of thinking was off base, or if the defense was sidelining the procedures. Then the legal officer, the law officer, could say that is not legal. And without knowing it, one of my granduncles was actually a legal officer in one of these trials. I never knew that until after he passed away, and I would see his name in the transcripts of the proceedings. And he did ask many questions. He did settle things during the trials he was involved in. So this is the chief prosecution. He was the head of the prosecution service, Captain Maronilla Seva, and he's looking here at a board which indicates the procedure or the status of the various trials at that time. Of course, there were no computers at that time, so this is just basically a blackboard. It's a chart showing who has already been sentenced, what the timetable is, and so forth. This is the head of the defense team, Captain Pedro Serran. There's not very much I know about him yet, but he's a very interesting character because if you read the transcripts, he does intercede very often, trying to say that the witness was out of order or what have you. And he did his work very well. So even after the courts would find the Japanese guilty, pass down a verdict, there would still be a procedure to review this. It would be passed on to a higher board, which transcended the commissions themselves, the Board of Review, and they would see whether it was fair or not. And if they found it fair, then it would still be raised to the Philippine Army Commanding General. And if he found it fair, he would raise it to the Justice Secretary. If necessary, the President of the Philippines himself would be consulted on whether a particular decision was fair or not. So there were a number of cases where the President himself stepped in. Now, during the period of the trial, 1947 to 1949, roughly 2 years, there were many problems that the commissions faced, both for the defense and for the prosecution. One was lack of positive identification of perpetrators. First, Japanese names were difficult to remember. Not everybody was a Sato or a Suzuki or what have you. They had different names. And in fact, when you were asked to explain or to describe a particular Japanese who bayoneted your mother, for example, would you be able to remember the face of that particular Japanese? You were just struck with horror at what was happening. So you simply had no time to. Did he have a beard? Was he tall?
Mhm.
Was he bow-legged? There was no time for that. So how could one actually identify these perpetrators positively? And then there was also lack of funds. As with this was right after the war, the Philippines was recovering from all the war damages that had been suffered, and so there were not enough funds. So to pay for uh, copying, to
Mhm.
pay for the stenographers, to bring witnesses from other parts of the Philippines to Manila to testify in their behalf. It was extremely difficult to do this. So not all the witnesses could be brought to Manila. Sometimes their affidavits would be brought in, but in other cases, some incidents without any direct witness or identifiable perpetrator were simply closed and not pursued because there was no one to testify or there was no positive identification for the Japanese who committed the crimes. So if we look at some of the highlights of the trials, the highest ranking Japanese officers tried were Lieutenant General Shigenori Kuroda, who was the commanding general of all Japanese army forces in the Philippines from 1943 to 44. And his counterpart in the Navy was Rear Admiral Takesue Furuse, who commanded a naval force in the southern part of Manila during the Battle of Manila, was ordered to and made his way to the east side of Luzon, where a massacre took place. There would be emotional outbursts in the courtroom. And the courtroom here was not the big courtroom that we saw earlier with the Yamashita trial. The Americans were now repairing the High Commissioner's residence to become the U.S. Embassy. And so they were using temporary buildings fairly close to Manila City Hall. So these were small rooms, and the witnesses were usually very close to the accused. And in some cases, you have the witnesses not just spouting curses at the Japanese accused, but even trying to move out of the witness box and throttle them with their own
Mhm.
bare hands. So very emotional. And this is understandable because it's happening only 2 years after the war, 2 years, 3 years after the war. The trials ranged from a few months to almost a year. Some of them were bogged down with technical difficulties. Others had to wait for witnesses to be brought in. And if you look at one case, the shortest case ever lasted exactly 3 days. This was the case of Admiral Furuse. As mentioned earlier, Admiral Furuse commanded a Japanese Navy unit in the south of Manila during the Battle of Manila, had been ordered out and moved to the eastern part of Luzon, and there his troops committed that atrocity that we saw earlier in Infanta. When the trial opened, after the introductions, after the usual beginning parts of the trial, when Furuse was asked whether he was guilty or not, he pled guilty right away,
Mm.
and the defense was shocked at that. How could this guy drop the case? And even the prosecution, do you know what you're talking about? Do you know what you're doing? So they gave him 24 hours. So the next day, they came up together and they asked him, what is your plea? Guilty or not guilty? And Admiral Furusa said, I am guilty. I am full of remorse what happened. I take full responsibility for what my men did in Infanta. And again, both defense and prosecution would say, do you realize what this means? You might get the death sentence. And he said, I know fully well what I am doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. And so on the third day, the case was closed. So I was especially intrigued by when I came across Admiral Furusa's name in the list of those who were tried, hoping to get some insight into what happened in the Battle of Manila, the naval
Mhm.
organization, and so forth. And when I got these three very thin volumes, it was only about 50 pages or even less. So it lasted for 3 days. So, well, that's it. He ended the trial himself.
Wow.
The high-ranking officers, again, the precedent of the Yamashita trial, that command responsibility, meant that you were guilty for what your lower levels committed, the crimes your lower levels committed. So command responsibility was applied to the cases involving prisoners of war, massacres, and torture. Lieutenant General Kuroda was tried for those anti-guerrilla pacification campaigns, the tortures by the Kempeitai, and so forth. The same thing was done for Lieutenant General Shizuo Yokoyama, who was also involved in the Battle of Manila. The case of Lieutenant General Kuroda is a rather interesting one because Kuroda was a very outspoken general in the Japanese army. You can read it in the transcript, and he's talking much more than one expects of a defense, someone in the defense. And even during his term as commanding general of the army forces in the Philippines, his conclusion was the Philippines cannot be defended if the Americans come back. So all I'm going to do is try to maintain peace and order, but I'm not going to build up any defenses for the Americans to come in. So when finally the Philippines was in the firing line after the fall of the Marianas, Saipan, Guam, and so forth, the Philippines was next in line, and the Japanese general staff asked Kuroda, "Are you ready for an invasion?" And they sent someone to look and see what preparations had been made. And the representative from Tokyo was shocked that virtually nothing had been done. And Kuroda, in fact, gained the reputation of the playboy general, that he was actually spending more time with girls, women, uh, wine, and song. So, classic wine, women, and song. Knowing that it was impossible to defend the Philippines, he read books, some of those in the MacArthur Library in the Manila Hotel, and he played golf. So he did nothing actually to prepare the Philippines for the defense. So he was called back to Japan in late 1944, scolded for what he had failed to do, and was not given a command after that. In fact, what is interesting is that Kuroda, since he did not actually actively pursue more seriously some of the military campaigns or preparations, there were a number of Filipinos who actually spoke in his defense and said that how could he prepare for war when he was playing golf with us all the time? So, because of that, Kuroda was given a life sentence. Okay, it's not serious enough for a death sentence. He will be given a life sentence. He would eventually be sent back to Japan, I think for health reasons, much earlier than the others. Yokoyama was held responsible for the atrocities in the Battle of Manila and also the atrocities south of Manila. And in fact, many of the records, many of the exhibits that were used in the Yamashita trial were also brought to the Yokoyama trial, and same witnesses were brought in as well. So it's like deja vu. When you go over the Yokoyama trial, you see the Yamashita trial, at least the Manila phase, taking place again. Well, he was not directly responsible for the atrocities. The guy who was in charge directly of the atrocities in Manila was a Navy admiral, Rear Admiral Iwabuchi. But he had committed suicide, and so there was no one to try. So Yokoyama, being his senior, again, the principle of command responsibility, so he was held in, responsible for the atrocities that Iwabuchi's Navy men committed. Incidentally, I met the grandson of General Yokoyama last year and explained to me what he remembered of his grandfather. It was interesting to see a totally different picture because when we look at officers during the war, they are gruff, they are scowling, they're all very disciplined and they want to implement discipline and all that. But the story I got from him was he was just a doting grandfather, a very different figure from what I had been led to believe during the war. Now, the other officers and men who were tried by the Philippine tribunals were kempeitai, or military police officers and enlisted men, all the way from colonels down to warrant officers, non-commissioned officers, and so forth. And there were garrison commanders and small unit commanders, or even non commissioned officers who were held responsible for civilian deaths and tortures in anti guerrilla operations and many of the massacres that took place towards the end of the war. There was a separate group of other Japanese who were accused, and these were pre-war Japanese residents or civilians who served as interpreters or guides for the Japanese patrols or for the Japanese garrisons. It seems some of them took advantage of their new position of power to wreak vengeance on people who had righted or who had wronged them before the war. So there were these personal wounds that maybe your neighbor had maltreated you or had given you bad looks before the war. And now some of these uh, interpreters could take their vengeance on their neighbors. So this is one of the Japanese who took the stand. Since this is after the war, there are a number of photographs that are around of the Japanese trials. This is Tokuji Teramoto. He was one of those local garrison commanders. He was in northern Luzon and he was accused of murdering in cold blood or ordering his men to murder several people in villages and towns in the north. Later, he was found guilty and he was one of those executed by the Philippine government. Another of those who was charged was this Gintaro Shirota, a former Kempeitai officer who was actually given the death sentence because he was directly involved in the executions of a number of suspected guerrillas and prominent persons in the Philippines. He was meted the death penalty, but was eventually pardoned by the government. There would also be specific incidents such as the killing of Jose Abad Santos, who was the highest ranking Philippine government official executed in the war in May of 1942. He had been captured by General Kawaguchi's forces in the central Philippines, taken to Mindanao, and had received order after order from Manila to execute Jose Abad Santos. Kawaguchi did not understand why there was this very strong drive to execute Abad Santos. He was actually acting president of the Philippines at this time because the Commonwealth government had gone into exile in the US. So Abad Santos was the highest ranking official of the government at this time. And Kawaguchi, who was in command of the local unit that had captured him, that was keeping him, brought him to Mindanao, questioned the order for execution. He questioned it twice. And Manila apparently lost patience, repeated the order 3 times, and at the end sent an emissary from Manila to his own encampment to ensure that that order would be carried out. So the order of execution was supposed to have emanated from a Japanese officer, a general in the Japanese military administration. This was General Hayashi. And what is interesting about this case is that Kawaguchi and Hayashi were classmates in the Japanese military academy. So apparently they did not get well on together at this time. And Kawaguchi would testify to the best of his knowledge, remembering that there were 3 orders, that emissary came, and he really had no choice but to execute Abad Santos. He would save Abad Santos' son, who was with them, but he had very strong misgivings about executing this very prominent Philippine politician. General Hayashi, on the other hand, questioned everything that Kawaguchi said. Said Kawaguchi is lying. The orders that he says emanated from my desk are false. These are fabrications. They are being made to, they're being done to make me look bad and so forth. In the end, the defense lawyers, because this is one particular case involving two officers, the defense lawyers were in a quandary. What do we do? They're telling different stories. We cannot reconcile them at all. So finally, because of that problem, Kawaguchi would decide, separate us. Let's divide this case into two cases. I will testify on my behalf. I will do away with the defense lawyers. Thank you for defending me earlier, but I will be my own defense. So it's a rather brave thing that he would do. I'm taking full responsibility for what happened. It is my I executed Abad Santos. I feel very strongly about it, but I had been ordered to do it. So I'm carrying out the order. Hayashi, till the end, would continue saying these are fabrications. I had nothing to do with the execution when the evidence was very, very strongly against him. So when the time came to deliver a sentence, Kawaguchi was given a life sentence. Okay, you executed this brilliant Filipino, but Hayashi, because of his lies under oath, was given a death sentence. For those of you who might be familiar with the Guadalcanal case, what happened in Guadalcanal, this General Kawaguchi is the same Kawaguchi who went to Guadalcanal and fought there. So he was there who bore the brunt of the American counteroffensive there. And during the trial, actually, he would request that some of the speeches be repeated because he would say, I am hard of hearing because of all the shells that I heard exploding next to me in Guadalcanal. On the left is General Kawaguchi, his trademark mustache, and on the right is General Hayashi. Again, they were classmates during the military academy days, but they really were at odds with each other in their testimony in this trial. So the first case that was tried was that of Chushiro Kudo, who was known as the Butcher of Bai. Bai is a town in Laguna province. He was a local unit commander. He was accused of massacring quite a number of civilians in the municipality of Bai, Laguna. After 2 months of hearings, he was found guilty and he was given the death sentence. And that was carried out shortly afterwards. The last case tried in 1949 was that of Major General Kenshichi Masuoka, who was the Kempei Tai chief in northern Luzon. Again, there was so much against him. He was accused of torture, of killing so many people, of the Kempei Tai under him, and so forth. This is the Butcher of Bai, Chushiro Kudo. Notice that he is here in American fatigues and American boots. This was taken just a few weeks before he actually was executed. So I think this was probably the final discussions on what appeals he could still make and so forth.
Just a quick question for you. Sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
when they were compiling cases, the prosecution teams, did they try and focus on one particular crime and build on that? Or did they focus all of them? Because what we've been learning with the Nazi trials is often they would just focus on one major one and only kind of vaguely reference other ones as sort of almost like character assessments. But, you know, it happened with Kurt Meyer in Normandy. They focused on the murder of Canadian prisoners in Normandy, but didn't focus on previous and latter allegations. So how is it working here? Are they kind of trying to say, look, take everything into consideration, or focusing on something?
In some cases, they focused on just one incident. I think in the case of Kawaguchi and Hayashi, it was really just that one incident, the execution of Abad Santos. The case of Admiral Furuse, it was really the Infanta case. They did not pursue the Southern Manila cases, actually, which I was kind of surprised at. And others, however, it's a whole litany of cases. Kempei Tai officials, for example, you have 7 or 8 separate cases of who was tortured, who was killed, who was missing. There were others. You have 1 or 2 major cases, incidents, but the others had maybe 7 or 8. So it varied from one to the other.
Because for me, it's if there's 7 cases against someone, 7 atrocities, but one of them is a bit, you're not certain about, and the defendant then says, well, I don't remember that, and I wasn't there that day, and it wasn't my orders. It
Yes.
starts to make all the cases then seem in doubt as well. So I can I mean, I'm not obviously from the legal profession. I understand it would be maybe easy or tempting to focus on the one you think can make stick the most. Look, we absolutely know you were there because we've got this signed order you gave or something, and we've got 18 eyewitnesses saying you did this. But
Yes.
it could also be tempting to rack up all the things someone did because it paints a complete picture of how despicable they are. So these are the kind of dilemmas that are facing these teams in both your part of the world and in Europe as well.
Yes. I think for the local cases, it was fairly easy to narrow it down because you would have the same people experiencing incidents on different periods of time.
Yeah.
So again, if it's one small locality, that's fairly easy. We can get people. We can build that case of, let's say, seven specific incidents of summary executions and so forth. But in other cases, yes, I think they decided to focus on just one or two. But if they were really high-profile characters like Kuroda or Nagahama, there was just a ton of evidence that they could present. And the
Okay, thank you.
character, yeah. Okay, so this is another one, just to show that the trial decisions were not uniform. They were not all death or life sentences. This is Yoshiaki Kodama. He was a former Kempeitai officer. He is the one in the center here. He was meted 12 years. Actually, most of these would actually be 12 they would be sentences in hard labor. And then this is another Kempeitai officer, Junzo Matsuta, and surprisingly, he was found not guilty. So he was sent to Japan after the trial ended. So totally uh, clear of any guilt. So the end of the trials, sentences, and executions. The last case ended late in 1949, and the National War Crimes Office closed shop shortly thereafter. It tried a total of 73 cases involving 338 Japanese. Of these 338 Japanese, 79 were meted death sentences, 71 by hanging, and 8 by musketry. Only 17 of these death sentences were carried out. If we compare that with the American tribunals earlier on, they had something like 69 death sentences, and all of them were carried out within a very short period of time. In this particular case, even after the death sentences were issued, I think they waited 1 year, let things simmer down, and then they executed one, executed two, and by 1951, they executed a whole bunch. So 31 life terms were meted, handed down, 27 fixed terms were handed down, and 13 cases were acquitted, and 187 Japanese, probably because of the failure to conclusively identify them, were cleared. 3 cases were dismissed because they could not stand up to trial. So in the end, even as the trials went on, critics voiced their concerns on different sides. Most of the critics were very much against the trials. They felt, why are we giving the Japanese this time to defend themselves? Why are we paying for everything when they killed Filipinos? So some of them said it has to be done faster. We have to be more decisive about this. So, all right, we can hold them, but let's do what they did to us. They didn't give us any trials whatsoever. So let's uh, execute them. Some Filipinos even felt all of them are guilty. We don't have to try them. Let's just execute them all. Others felt that this was kind of like victor's justice, and therefore it would stain the Philippine record if everyone was found guilty, and if we did carry out these trials on a very ramshackle basis. So it was interesting to see what was being written in the papers and the public opinion letters, how some of them were for the trial, but most wanted it to end as soon as possible. Now, Japan expressed its concern for the convicts, and individuals wrote the Philippine presidency for clemency. In fact, during this whole period of time, Japan was not an independent state. Japan was under Allied occupation, and so it was not an independent government yet. One interesting thing about the Japanese accused and the convicted war criminals, was that they were actually given religious freedom. They were given a Japanese Buddhist monk came to listen to their spiritual needs. A Christian missionary was also sent to try to get them to convert to Christianity. And quite a number actually converted to Christianity. The others became more spiritual in nature after being exposed to this Buddhist monk. And to the Japanese who were now reading about tragedy of these men who were waiting for execution or were serving their sentence, many Japanese wrote the Philippine government to ask them to grant them clemency, that they were, after all, human beings. By this time, also, the Cold War had deepened and the new international concerns arose. This was the Cold War. Big powers were taking
Yeah.
sides. Japan was seen as a potential ally at this
Yeah.
time. And when the Korean War broke out in 1951, the San Francisco Peace Treaty was signed shortly thereafter. The Philippine government signed it, but did not ratify it because of several dangling issues. The issue of reparations, the issue of justice, and so forth. The Philippine Senate refused to ratify San Francisco Peace Treaty. The Japanese ended, or rather, the Allied occupation of Japan ended with the San Francisco Peace Treaty, but the Philippine government was not willing to welcome Japan as a friend yet, or even recognize Japan as an equal country. This period of time also saw several domestic problems in the Philippines. There was an internal civil war, in
Mm.
essence, going on, the so called Hook Rebellion. There were trade issues. There was the issue of rebuilding from the ruins and so forth. So, actually, the trials would not have been given that much publicity because uh, what was more important was national security.
Yeah.
More important was rebuilding from the ruins. That's why other people just wanted to get the trials over with and execute the Japanese. So this is one of the news magazine headlines at that time. Let me hang them, and it's a whole bunch of people who are ready. If the people up there will not hang them, I will hang them. And why would they be hung? Not for vengeance, but for justice, says the one on the right. On the left, there's one that is a little uh, skeptical about this. The score can never be evened out, but still, we have to find a way out. In the end, the San Francisco Peace Treaty was signed in 1951, but again, not ratified by the Philippine Senate until 1956. The Japanese accused and convicted were given very humane treatment. The Japanese Buddhist chaplain was allowed in, and as mentioned, also Christian missionaries came in. A Japanese painter who had painted propaganda themes for the Japanese military during the war realized how tragic all of this was. And interestingly enough, this Japanese painter, Kanrai Kano, was a neighbor of Admiral Furuse. And Admiral Furuse had been sent back home when the war ended. And when he was up for trial, he had to be brought back to the Philippines. So Kano realized this is a very tragic thing that uh, we thought this Admiral Furuse was cleared already, and now he has to be sent back to the Philippines. So he wrote letter after letter to the Philippine president at that time to forgive the unforgivable. Finally, on July 4, 1953, President Quirino granted special pardon to all Japanese war criminals with fixed jail terms. They would be returned to Japan, and those with death sentences would be commuted to life terms, and all those with life terms would be repatriated to Japan and serve their sentences there. But before Quirino's term ended, at the end of 1953, Quirino granted all Japanese convicted war criminals, all of whom were in Japan at that time, a special amnesty. This paved the way. This is President Quirino, and he would say he was the last person to forgive the Japanese because his wife, his children, many relatives were killed in the battle for Manila. So this was a very controversial decision. But Quirino would go on record to say, I cannot keep hatred in my heart forever. And so these are some of the Japanese convicted war criminals learning about the special pardon given by the Philippine government. On the left, we see General Hayashi, who had lied and lied in his testimony in the trial, in the execution of Abad Santos. To his right is General Yokoyama, who was involved, was partly involved in the massacres in Manila. And on the right, to General Yokoyama's right, is Admiral Furuse, looking very boyish at this point. It was he who was the Navy commander in the Infanta massacre. And on the right side, uh, you see General Masuoka, the Kempei Tai chief of Northern Luzon, the last to be tried of the set. But these were the highest ranking war criminals on hearing that they would be sent back to Japan and that they would be pardoned. So these actions paved the way for closing the reparations agreement with Japan, and it eventually led to the ratification by the Philippine Senate of the San Francisco Peace Treaty in July 1956. So today, the war crimes trials conducted by the Philippine government are hardly known to anybody. They are not discussed in schools. They are hardly mentioned in school book histories. So this is something that is well worth looking back on.
Mm.
I gave a lecture on this subject at the College of Law, University of the Philippines College of Law, and they were especially intrigued by the Filipino defense lawyers. These are people who had their, it was their, their ideas, their, 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 their loyalties were not to themselves or to
Mm.
even to the country. It was loyalty to a higher thing. It was an ideology, and they were extremely impressed by that. And even the Japanese, when the Japanese returned back to Japan, many of them wrote these lawyers and thanked them profusely. Even those who were executed. The one member, the one lawyer I knew, told me that he failed to defend his client. He was executed. But before his execution, that Japanese officer wrote a very moving letter thanking him for all the efforts that he had done to save his life. And so I
Well,
guess that let me end my presentation this evening or this afternoon. And thank you very much for having me on the program.
well, as always, an absolute masterclass. And the word that came to mind when you were talking about the Filipino contribution was dignity. That they were dignified, they were respectful. Of course, the overriding theme with these war crime shows we're doing is that there is this nagging doubt that justice wasn't applied enough, that people got out a bit too early, and there weren't enough prosecutions, there weren't enough sentences. And I think we can all agree that's we feel that way. And Des just said over there, I think they shouldn't have been pardoned by the Filipino government. So yeah, there's still some
Yes.
hostility there. But we had a question from Scott Grimwood, which I'm going to expand on, about were there any war crimes trials held after 1945 when new evidence or witnesses were uncovered? Because
Mhm.
in Europe we had the Eichmann trial in the 60s and then Klaus Barbie in the 80s, and even today they occasionally drag out some former concentration camp guard, and they make a big thing about putting him in trial. And
Mhm.
Philippines, is there still any sense of that there are people out there that should be brought to justice, and that there is it, are people investigating? Do you have a Filipino Simon Wiesenthal, for example, who was on the case?
No, I don't think that ever happened. I think once the war crimes trials were over, that was it. I think people moved on to other things. What's interesting is if you look back at what happened in 1974, you have the last Japanese straggler coming out and surrendering.
Mm,
This was uh, this was Lieutenant Onoda, and he came out of an island in the south of Luzon, and he surrendered. Last of the stragglers to come out. There were some who said he should be tried for trial for war
mm,
crimes because he was stealing chickens and pigs, and he was shooting at people in Lubang Island, but that was never pursued. In fact, the
mm,
government line was Onoda's example is good for the Filipinos. that it showed loyalty above and beyond call of duty. And that was a period of martial law. And I remember
Mm,
President Marcos, in fact, saying this is something all Filipinos should follow, the loyalty to the higher cause. And the local people are still quite mad at what happened.
mm.
They felt, he should be made accountable for what he did in those years after the war. But nothing happened. And
Mm.
as for the others, I think there was no one even wanted to push further, especially once Japan began opening its trade relations with the Philippines. People began to look at trade and other things and how we could trade with them and security issues also. But I think the issue of war criminals, war crimes, and trying them, I think that hardly anybody ever thought about it again.
Mm.
It was
I think
closed.
well, thank you very much for that considered response. And I think again, one of my takeaways from this is that in 2025, when I was looking for historians who can speak on this subject and looking at books, and there are books saying that, and
Yes.
people saying, as I just said, justice wasn't done enough. Everybody, the Nazis, the worst Japanese didn't get enough sentences. But there are other people still saying that there was vengeance involved. They didn't get a fair trial. It was all just revenge. And it's like when I get accused on this channel of being too left wing or too right wing or talking not enough or talking too much. My shows are too long and they're too short at the same time. If you're getting accused of both things,
Hmm.
the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And the truth is that it probably was fair. I mean, I think that is what my takeaway is, that despite the clunkiness of some of the procedures, despite the fact we have this nagging doubt that some people got off a bit lightly,
Yeah.
procedures were followed correctly. There was, as I said earlier, there was dignity, there was respect, there was lots of analysis as they went on. There's reviews. They kept saying, "Are we sure about this? Are we absolutely 100%? Let's read this again. Let's check that again. Let's double check with this." And I think that was the best way. I think we can collectively agree that we handled it the most dignified way, the respectful way, with this attempt to make sure due process was followed. And yeah, it's complicated, but it's been fascinating.
Yeah. I think that that's true. Again, the mood of the Philippines was very anti-Japanese.
Yeah,
Anyone who was suspected of looking like Japanese was easily beaten up or what have you. So yeah, it's something that I think the Philippines was a new country. It was something
yeah.
that wanted to show the world we are young, but we are mature enough to carry
Yeah.
out something like this. I think that was behind
I
the.
mean, again, that's my given that you're at this point, you're an absolutely brand new country, and you have experienced some of the worst atrocities the Japanese committed. It's like you're the that part of the world's equivalent of Poland in some ways. Although Myanmar, Burma would argue they had some of the same as well. But it's not like the Japanese occupation is just sort of passing you by without any effect. It's absolutely affecting. You've been through from the Bataan death march onwards, right through to the rampage in Manila in 45. And yet, despite all the horror of that, you came out and said, no, we're better than this. We are better than the Japanese. We are a country where we have systems, we have courts, we have a process. There's a legal, and you're building on a very new your own identity with this the American tradition that you have of making sure that you're doing it the right way. And I think given where the Philippines is now globally, and I think quite well respected by most people trading across the world, that era you did back then was important in
Mhm.
your progression. So
Yes.
it sounds very patronizing, but well done, the Philippines. I'm going to say there, it's
Yeah. Well,
well
I
handled. So
noticed. I noticed one of the comments was there any extrajudicial effort to right the wrongs? It came somewhat earlier. Yes, there actually was some degree of extrajudicial vengeance, if you might say. Guerrillas, for example, would
yeah,
people just beat up the closest Japanese they saw, and that's why the Americans had to take pains to
yeah,
insulate the Japanese prisoners from these irate civilians. They were
mm,
throwing stones and they were cursing the Japanese in their own language. A number of them were tied up and trussed up like pigs
yeah,
and all this. But I think the government wanted to show we are above that. And I
yeah,
think
exactly.
this is one thing that both the prosecution and the defense would come up saying, we are fighting for precisely what the Japanese occupation denied us.
Yes.
Lack of a podium to discuss things, a
Yeah.
lack of space to discuss this. We are showing that we are one level higher than the occupiers because we are following procedure.
Brian is saying, will you write a book about this particular aspect? And if I would go for it. I think I'm not gonna say you should, but yeah, I think this aspect is very important. I know you've written several books and you lecture and you talk and you teach, but I think that this it's part of a bigger story. It's both a war crime story, but it's also a broad part of Filipino history, and as indeed all the things you've talked about on this channel, the resistance, the occupation, it's all, you know, you can't take it out of your country's history. It's like where I live in France, the occupation, the resistance, the mythology, you can't ignore that chapter. It's very, very important. Well, I'll leave the thought of a book with you in there, and you can have a think about that. But
I have a quick answer to that. I just met with some officials from the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office last week, and they did ask me to write about it. And since I've accumulated so much stuff already, it's about time that I will do it. I've been asked by the National Archives of the Philippines to come up with a kind of researcher's guide to the war crimes trial papers. They are in the Philippine National Archives. So I actually have several of the trials myself, but I have access to the others. And I will be writing that kind of user's guide for the war crimes trial papers, but I will be writing my own.
Brilliant. Well, we'll leave it there. So, folks, thank you very much for listening to this and your questions. As you understood, most of them were answered by Ricardo as he went on through this. So we're back on Sunday, a rare Sunday show. Zita is joining me to talk about Rommel's development as a commander from 1914 to 40. And it is mostly generals we're looking at next week. So MacArthur, we're looking at Rommel, we're looking at others over the course of Guderian. So as always, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, read their blogs, go to their websites, etc., etc. But I will see you all on Sunday. Cheers, everybody. Thanks. Bye.